recruiters came to the village singing a song about the glory of the battle, and, you know, of course, it isn't anything like that when you get your hands into the business of fighting, yeah. What about you?
Assistant to a gentleman at Norwich, an eminent alchemist, physician and astrologer, amongst other things.
Right. An astrologer, you say, right?
Yes, the celestial bodies, their movements.
Huh?
Prediction, prophecy, divination.
Sounds badly paid.
Well, my master says that knowledge is its own payment.
Yeah, well, the only knowledge I have is that God controls my fate as he sees fit, and I try to draw consolation from that.
My master says, whilst we live in fear of hell, we have it.
That was a clip from Ben Wheatley's fantastic new film, A Field in England, which is set during the English Civil War in the 17th century. It's this amazing genre-defying mashup of horror, black comedy, costume drama, psychedelic trip. It's just this amazing movie that's very hard to categorise. But I'm going to try and explain to you why I love it so much and bring our Ben Wheatley retrospective to a close. Now, the thing that many people will know about this movie before seeing it is that it was radical in its release. So Ben Wheatley decided to have a simultaneous release in art house cinemas, on TV, on demand, and on DVD. And the idea was just to get this very sort of art house movie out to as many people as possible. And I think that's an absolutely fascinating sign of the times, of how we're now moving beyond that sort of traditional hierarchy of cinema, then TV, and this idea that you have a big bad cinema release and then you move on to DVD and then obviously on to TV later. And that somehow you have to see everything on TV. That in modern life, when we have iPads and phones and, you know, we Netflix whole box sets over a weekend, that really it's about just getting your content out on as many channels as possible. But actually this movie is radical for reasons that have nothing to do with its release. And I feel it's radical because of its form, because of the way in which it treats genre, and because of the daring of tackling a subject which really is very little filmed in England, which is the Civil War. And I feel that this is a really fascinating time in our history because it's a period in English history where the people rose up and challenged the very concept, not even of the divine right to rule, but that God himself is incarnate in the king. So by killing Charles I, you were really killing God. And I think that's radical and subversive and interesting of itself. But I also find this period fascinating because you're really at a time of life when established religion is on one end of a spectrum that ranges all the way to sort of pagan mysticism on the other, and that you can simultaneously have both beliefs. And I think we see that in the dialogue of this film where, you know, this concept of alchemy and magic and some kind of cultish power in the very soil of England is very much alive. And then, of course, it's a fascinating period of history because it was a brutal war. It was a war that split families in different loyalties, and also where you had this sort of peasantry, this soldiery, whose exploits and whose feelings were documented, more or less. And I think this film also, as that clip showed, gives something of the desire to escape it, that the reality of war is brutal and horrible. And some of the macabre and sinister humour and horror of this film derives from that very, very basic and unavoidable fact. So anyway, this is a very low-budget film, filmed for £300,000, I believe. And the way in which Ben Wheatley conveys all this richness and texture is very interesting insofar as he takes a very simple setting, a field in England, and he puts his actors in period costume. And he relies very much on, and he leans very heavily on this very rich, dense soundscape. The sound design for this movie is amazing. And it always feels as if the war's just over that hill, and you can almost taste the gun smoke in the air. And what we find as the movie opens is a group of escaping men, principally Whitehead, played by Reece Sheersmith, who you probably know, if at all, as Papa Lazarou, one of the characters he played on League of Gentlemen. And he is a guy who's slightly effeminate, maybe, certainly assured of his intellectual superiority, and someone who would think of himself as very gentle and fine. and he's an alchemist working for an apparently rather vicious master called Troa. And he bumps into these two escaping soldiers, runaways, and the guy who has corralled them. And it sort of starts off as a kind of really hilarious comedy of manners where this rather fine and offended man, Whitehead, is bumping up against these salt-of-the-earth soldiers who just want to take a decent crap after all their field rations and then find a good alehouse and get their rocks off. But it takes a turn for the worse when they bump into a very enigmatic, charismatic character called O'Neill, who is played by longtime regular of Ben Wheatley, Michael Smiley. It's not immediately clear what or who he is, but he does exert this strange, magical, cultish hold over the people that he meets. Partly, and this is no spoiler, it's very well telegraphed, because he serves them a dish of magic mushrooms. And we then enter this incredibly beautifully rendered but really sinister psychedelic trip in which he's doing very bizarre, weird things to these lads and getting them apparently to dig for some kind of hidden treasure that may or may not have magical properties. But that's a very simplistic kind of description of what's going on in this movie, because there's something, although there's very vivid depictions of violence and horror, as you would expect with the director of Kill List, sometimes the most sinister and scary parts of this movie are just sort of individual visual images. So there's one of Reece Sheersmith's character who's almost harnessed up as though to a plough. So it's almost like just a man bound by ropes. And there's this, is it pained or ecstatic expression on his face? And the ambiguity of how far he is complicit in his own undoing is just absolutely haunting. And one of the things that makes this film so porous, it's like whatever, we can read so much onto it, and it really does bear multiple viewings. And I've seen it a couple of times in time for this review, and every time I look at it, I'm disturbed, I'm provoked, I'm in awe at the beauty of it, and struggling to grasp it. And it's, I guess, very deliberately made to be hard to grasp, not just because it eschews typical linear narrative. I mean, there are a lot of jump cuts, there's a lot of enveloping of story so that you come back onto scenes that you've seen before. And at the same time, it breaks off sometimes for these living tableaux, which contrasts with the sometimes frenetic handheld camera work. You're just very slowly panning over these characters, absorbing the period detail of their costume. And then contrasted sometimes with the most banal comedy lines. My personal favourite line is when Fran says, "So you think about a thing before you touch it, am I right?" And Whitehead's like, "Is that not usual?" And Fran's like, "Not in Essex." Brilliant. I mean, I love the humour in this film. But this combination of the costume drama, the fact that it's filmed in black and white, the very dark comedy, the surreal nature of the psychedelic trip, and the fact that even when these guys aren't on magic mushrooms, there's a lot about this movie that does feel like you're on a trip. It feels almost like, at times, Ben Wheatley's channeling early Werner Herzog. That there are just crazy, beautiful images there. Not for the heck of it, because it's, despite its anarchy, an anarchy that matches the Civil War, it's very formally controlled. And in some aspects, it's more controlled than Ben Wheatley's other films, because the script feels more nailed down than the improv work in his earlier films. And of course, there's a formal manner to just the fact that he's chosen black and white that lends it a kind of cohesion. So it's a really fascinating mix of the gonzo and the incredibly deliberately handled. And that creates this taut tension that I think makes the film an absolute success. So I would say that if you're used to Ben Wheatley's films, this is kind of nothing like them and everything like them. So it's neither as horrific as Kill List, nor as out-and-out funny as Sightseers, although it has elements of both. It has some of the kind of down and dirty language and just banal everyday humour of Down Terrace and Kill List. And also some of his obsessions, the idea that there is something magical and mythical and cultish in the very soil of this country. And yet somehow in the way he's combined all these elements and gone back to things like, the costume drama, has just created a movie that's unlike anything I've ever seen. So I hope you have a chance to check it out. If you agree or disagree on the take, please leave a comment on the blog at b007.com. It brings to an end our Ben Wheatley retrospective, but I just cannot wait to see what he does next.
He's great. great-grandfather was a king, although for only 30 seconds, when put in charge of beheading, he felt that fame and glory beckoned. Blackadder, Blackadder, no such blooming rock. Blackadder, Blackadder, Elizabethan schmuck. Blackadder, Blackadder, nothing goes as planned. Blackadder, Blackadder, life deals him a bomb hand.
A Field in England was released simultaneously in cinemas, on demand and on TV on July 5th. It has a running time of 87 minutes and is rated 15 in the UK for strong language, one occurrence of very strong violence and gory images. The end credit music for this podcast is taken from the TV show Blackadder, and it's the season 1 main title by Dominic Hauser and sung by Howard Goodall. Admittedly, it's from the wrong period of English history, but I love Blackadder, and I think that mix of comedy, historicity, deep intelligence, but irreverence is very fitting for A Field in England.